When we talk about the autonomic efferent pathways, so we're going to be talking about how these are really divided up into two different general groups. So we can talk about the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. So let's start by going over what the parasympathetic division is. So the parasympathetic side of the autonomic efferent pathway is it's meant to carry information that generally puts the body toward a resting state. So this encourages, you could say, resting state activities. That would include things like digestion, sleepiness. It's characterized by generally a decrease in blood pressure and heart rate. You generally get a level of pupillary constriction. You may get some level of airway constriction. You get increased digestive activity, so increased digestive activity. And changes in blood flow. Which areas are getting blood flow? So things like the digestive tract gets more blood flow under these circumstances, and skeletal muscles get less. If you get a lot of activity in the parasympathetic system, that generally tends to produce unconsciousness. Now, it's also worth noting that you don't have to get all of these at once. So, for example, every time your pupils get smaller, you don't also have a decrease in blood pressure. These can be very targeted. Now, in contrast, the sympathetic nervous system encourages the body to be in sort of an active responses. Sometimes people say that a large-scale shift to sympathetic activity, sometimes people call that the fight or flight response. Or they'll call the sympathetic nervous system the fight or flight system, as opposed to parasympathetic, which is sometimes called the rest and digest system. So parasympathetic activity generally produces the opposite responses over here. You get increase in heart rate and blood pressure, pupils and airways dilate, you get increased blood flow to the heart, liver, and skeletal muscle. And generally decreased digestive activity. And while it is true that, just like the parasympathetic, you don't have to get all of these at once, the sympathetic side has a slight tendency to activate sort of more altogether than the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is a little more targeted. This tends to be a little more unified in its responses. Now, that said, people tend to overestimate how much our body does one of these or the other. The normal state in your body is for there to be some level of activity in both of these systems. So typical is you'll get some level of activity in sympathetic and parasympathetic that shifts back and forth depending on what you need at any given moment. So at one moment you might need more sympathetic activity, at the next you shift to more parasympathetic activity. It is unusual to be all one or all the other. If you're all parasympathetic, you'd probably faint immediately because your blood pressure would drop too low. And all sympathetic, that's kind of the extreme version of the fight or flight response. Most organs are innervated by both. So most organs receive input from both of these divisions. So for example, your heart receives input from both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic input tends to speed it up, the parasympathetic slows it down, and you get a shifting balance back and forth as to who has more influence at any given moment. And that determines your heart rate overall, whether you're getting more sympathetic or more parasympathetic activity. So in most cases, that influence is what we call antagonistic. Meaning that the two systems have opposite effects on the organ. So again, in the heart, one speeds it up, sympathetic, the other slows it down, parasympathetic. In most digestive areas, sympathetic decreases the activity, parasympathetic increases the activity. There are some areas where you need both in the right times to get the responses you want, but in general, they're antagonistic control, and what you get is kind of who's more in charge at that moment. Now, it's easy to take a look at this and say, well, okay, so from this, the sympathetic must be excitatory and the parasympathetic must be inhibitory, but that is absolutely not the case. So sympathetic does not mean excitatory. Sympathetic does not always make things more active. In both systems activate some things and deactivate others. So the sympathetic tends to increase the activity in the heart, but it decreases activity in digestive areas and the smooth muscle around your airways, which lets them dilate. Parasympathetic increases digestive activity and increases activity in the airways, which makes them constrict, but decreases activity in some other areas. So don't think of it as excitatory and inhibitory. Keep in mind that it's shifting the body's general state from am I ready for immediate action or am I ready for more of calm down and rest and digest my food. So what we're going to do next is talk about a little bit about the physical arrangement of how these things are organized, what neurotransmitters and receptors they use, and then we'll get into a little bit about the anatomy of how they're arranged. So let me change this around and let's make this sort of a schematic diagram. So we're going to imagine we've got the central nervous system here, and we're going to have whatever target we're going to be controlling over here. And in the previous lecture, you probably remember that we gave examples of somatic efferent pathways. So in a somatic efferent pathway, we've got a cell body in the central nervous system, that's the lower motor neuron cell body, and an axon that comes out and synapses onto the target organ. One neuron covers the whole pathway. And so you know the neurotransmitter used here is acetylcholine, and this will have what we call nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So this lower motor neuron releases acetylcholine at this synapse, and the target, in this case, would be skeletal muscle. Will have some kind of, will have nicotinic acetylcholine receptors to respond to that acetylcholine. But it's one neuron from the central nervous system to the target. All of this out here is the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, all but one of the autonomic pathways we're going to have. So this is going to be sort of autonomic in general, not any specific pathway. Autonomic pathways have two neurons. You're going to have one neuron that starts in the central nervous system and that somewhere out in the periphery synapses onto a second neuron whose axon will then go to the target. That means that in autonomic pathways, you've almost always got a cluster of nerve cell bodies like this out somewhere in the periphery. And what do we call a cluster of nerve cell bodies in the periphery outside the CNS? We call that a ganglion. So in most autonomic pathways, somewhere out here you will have a ganglion where the presynaptic cell synapses onto the postsynaptic cell. That's some terminology you should get used to. So when I talk about a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron, you know I mean one whose cell body is in the central nervous system that synapses onto its target somewhere out in the periphery. And then that postganglionic neuron goes from the ganglion to the target organ. So let's take a look at how the parasympathetic pathways work. We have preganglionic cells with their cell body in the central nervous system. We'll talk in a little bit about where. They have long axons and synapse onto a target somewhere, synapse onto their postganglionic cell somewhere close to the target. So in parasympathetic pathways, the ganglion is near or sometimes inside the target organ. Now, in terms of neurotransmitters, the preganglionic cell is going to use acetylcholine, and the postganglionic cell will have, I've written there NACHR. That stands for nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Same as these. Let's just make a note of that's notchers. I know a little bit about scientists, and I know that somebody tried real hard to find a way to make that end in an O so they could have nachos, but it didn't, so it's a notcher. The postganglionic cell in parasympathetic pathways also uses acetylcholine as its transmitter, and the target will have what's called a muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Right now, just know that muscarinic receptors receive acetylcholine, but they work differently than nicotinic receptors. So we'll talk about the difference there. So just to recap that, parasympathetic pathways have a preganglionic neuron that starts in the central nervous system and has a long axon, goes to a target somewhere near the target organ or is sometimes inside it, synapses onto the postganglionic cell, which is short, and that synapses onto the target, whatever that is. That's going to be either smooth muscle or a gland. The preganglionic cell uses acetylcholine as its transmitter. The postganglionic cell has nicotinic receptors. The postganglionic cell has acetylcholine as its transmitter, and the target organ will have muscarinic receptors to respond to that. All right, let's take a look at sympathetic pathways. And because things can never be too simple, there are actually several different versions of this. Most sympathetic pathways look like this. Preganglionic cell starts in the central nervous system, has a short axon, and synapses onto the postganglionic cell close to the central nervous system. That postganglionic cell then sends its axon out to synapse onto a target. That target is also, again, going to be smooth muscle or gland. The preganglionic cell uses acetylcholine as its transmitter, and the postganglionic cell has nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. The postganglionic cell, though, is going to use something called norepinephrine, which we usually just abbreviate NE. And the target organ will have what we call an adrenergic receptor. So there's two big differences in the normal sympathetic pathways compared to the parasympathetic. Sympathetic pathways have their ganglion close to the target, so their preganglionic cell is short, postganglionic is long, whereas parasympathetic are the other way around, ganglion is close to the target. In both cases, at the ganglion, the preganglionic cell uses acetylcholine, postganglionic cell has nicotinic receptors. But at the postganglionic cell, in sympathetic uses norepinephrine, and target has adrenergic receptors. And in parasympathetic, the postganglionic cell has acetylcholine, and the target has muscarinic receptors. That may sound a little bit like a lot of jargon. If it does, don't worry too much. We'll be talking about it again, plus you can just rewatch this as many times as you need to. It's one of the advantages of doing these in this recorded fashion. But because we can't have it be too simple, there are some alternative sympathetic pathways. In some cases, the preganglionic cell actually has a long axon and there's a ganglion close to the target. Neurotransmitters are the same. So these are mostly going to lower abdominal and pelvic organs. So the smooth muscle and gland down in the lower abdomen, that's how those pathways usually work. And then there is one pathway where there is no ganglion. This one is specifically going to the adrenal medulla. We'll talk a little bit about how that works. And in that case, this is still a preganglionic cell, so it's still releasing acetylcholine. So, just to sum up what we've got here, comparing to somatic efferent pathways, which have a single neuron from the central nervous system that goes straight to the target, autonomic pathways, whether they are parasympathetic or sympathetic, almost all of them have two neurons in the pathway, a preganglionic cell and a postganglionic cell. They meet at a ganglion somewhere out in the body. And the preganglionic cells always use acetylcholine as their transmitter. The postganglionic cells in the parasympathetic pathway use acetylcholine. In the sympathetic, they use norepinephrine. And targets from the parasympathetic have muscarinic receptors there. Targets from sympathetic will have adrenergic receptors. Now, we mentioned, as an example, that something like the heart, I'm going to draw an anatomically incorrect heart here, is the target of both parasympathetic and sympathetic. So you might ask, what kind of receptors does it have? And the answer is both. It will have both muscarinic and adrenergic receptors. So it can respond to input from either one of those. So a given target organ will probably have both kinds of receptors to respond to both kinds of input, since most organs get input from both. Alrighty. Now, I'm going to switch to another diagram and kind of translate this into slightly more anatomical terms. And then we'll go over the specific neurotransmitters and receptors. So let's add another thing. Now, on this diagram, we're going to draw over here. This is going to be slightly less schematic. We'll draw a brain and a spinal cord. Now let's talk about let's look at how first before I do that. Over here I'm going to put some of the organs that these things might target, and I'm not much of an artist, so here, for example, the eye. This is meant to be a salivary gland. We'll have here a heart. Let's put a sweat gland here. Over here we will put on top of the kidney the adrenal medulla. That is specifically this part here in the middle of the adrenal gland. And let's also include some digestive organs, so stomach and duodenum and intestines. And some reproductive organs. So we'll put in a uterus, like so. All right, so these are just some examples of the targets that you might have. So let's take a look at how the parasympathetic pathway might work. Parasympathetic preganglionic cells start in the brainstem and in the lower part of the spine, an area called the sacral spinal cord. So they actually start in two widely separated areas. The ones up here in the brainstem send their axons out. These are on cranial nerves. So these are going to ganglia close to their targets. So there is the one going to the eye. Salivary glands. These are not actually meant to be strictly anatomical here. There's our heart. And here we have that vagus nerve, which is heading down and innervating the postganglionic cells for a lot of the organs down here. And then from the from the sacral part of the spine, these preganglionic cells are the ones that are going to be innervating some of the lower down organs and the reproductive organs. So that's a kind of a crude example of the parasympathetic pathways that are starting up here, going to organs in the head and neck, and in the thorax and upper and kind of mid-abdomen. This would be the vagus nerve coming down here, actually all of this. And then the ones from the sacral spine go to some of the stuff lower down. Now let's take a look at the sympathetic pathways. Those preganglionic cells are going to start here in the thoracic and lumbar parts of the spine. Kind of the chest and back area of the spine. Now, remember we said sympathetic pathways mostly are the preganglionic cells are short and find ganglia close to the central nervous system. On either side of the spine, you find a set of ganglia known as the sympathetic chain. And those preganglionic cells mostly send their axons here to synapse onto postganglionic cells here in this chain. There's actually a lot of kind of crossing over and intermingling here in this chain. So the postganglionic cells tend to get innervated by a lot of preganglionic cells. And then those postganglionic cells are going to send their axons out to the various target organs. And mostly, they're going to the same organs. There are actually some organs that don't get innervated by both. One example would be the sweat glands, which only get sympathetic innervation. So now some of these preganglionic cells actually go through the chain but don't stop there. And some of those are the ones that are going to follow that second sympathetic pathway and have ganglia close to the target, like parasympathetic pathways do. So let's take this one down here. So you can see those are following that second sympathetic pathway. And then there's a couple of pathways that follow the third one, where actually the preganglionic cell has no ganglion and just goes straight to the adrenal medulla. So, what you're seeing here is that the parasympathetic pathway has its ganglia close to the target and originates in the brainstem and sacral spine. One other interesting thing is that the stuff in the middle of the body, in the thorax and upper and mid-abdomen, come from one of the cells in the brainstem that then comes down on the vagus nerve to get to all this stuff here in the thorax and abdomen. The sympathetic chain mostly synapses onto a chain of ganglia next to the spine, and then the postganglionic cells go from there, with some exceptions. The ones that go to the abdominal organs, some of those just go through there and synapse onto ganglia close to abdominal and pelvic organs, and one pathway where the preganglionic cell just goes straight to the adrenal medulla. All right, so this also shows you that most organs, like the eye here, salivary gland, heart, and so on, get input from both. So that's that idea of antagonistic control. A couple of exceptions: sweat glands only get sympathetic innervation, and the adrenal medulla only gets sympathetic. In fact, that's preganglionic innervation. All right, now, for our last thing, let's talk about the specific neurotransmitters and receptors used. So remember, parasympathetic pathways our postganglionic cell uses acetylcholine, and the target will have one of these muscarinic receptors. So let's take a moment to talk about what those muscarinic receptors are. So there are effectively three muscarinic receptors that we'll talk about. M1 muscarinic receptors are found mostly in salivary glands and stomach glands. And these tend to increase the activity of those glands. So when the parasympathetic system, the postganglionic cells, release acetylcholine onto these M1 receptors, they cause the salivary glands and the stomach glands to increase what they're secreting, which is stuff like saliva and stomach acid. We'll get to those later. M2 muscarinic receptors are mostly found on the heart. And they tend to decrease both the heart rate and the strength of contraction. So they'll make the heart beat slower and not quite as hard. And then finally, M3 muscarinic receptors are found in the bronchi, the smooth muscle of the bronchi, which are the air passages in the lungs, gastrointestinal muscle, some muscles in the eye, so this, like the circular muscle in the pupil, so in the iris, actually, around the pupil, and some blood vessels. And this tends to cause increased activity. So sometimes that's a little bit unintuitive. So if you imagine, if we've got a blood vessel with muscle in its walls, so muscle going around the wall, if I increase activity and make that muscle contract, what's it going to do to the blood vessel? Yeah, when that contracts, it's going to make the blood vessel more narrow. So when we say increased activity in a blood vessel or in an air passage, that usually means constriction when we're talking about a passageway. So putting acetylcholine onto the M3 receptors in the bronchi causes the airways to constrict. Now, let's take a look at the sympathetic adrenergic receptors. So in this case, the postganglionic cells use norepinephrine which we're going to abbreviate NE, and the target will have what we call adrenergic receptors. So we're going to talk about 4 different adrenergic receptors. Alpha 1 receptors respond best to norepinephrine. And I should explain that here. There's another chemical that these adrenergic receptors will respond to, which is called epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. That's not used as a neurotransmitter, but it is released from the adrenal medulla. And it circulates as a hormone, which means it goes everywhere in the body. So for each of these adrenergic receptors, we're going to indicate, do they respond better to norepinephrine, the stuff that comes from the nervous system itself, or the epinephrine, which is circulating in the blood when the sympathetic nervous system is active. It has some interesting characteristics. So for alpha-1 receptors, norepinephrine works better on them than epinephrine. These are found mostly on the radial muscles of the iris, they're also found in the walls of many blood vessels. And in a few other interesting areas, like the erector pili muscles, which are the muscles at the base of your hairs. So these are the muscles that actually make your hair stand on end. So generally, these increase the activity of what they're in. So when the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine onto its targets, depending on what those target is, it can cause dilation of the iris by activating the radial muscles. It can cause constriction of a lot of blood vessels, which decreases blood flow to some areas like skin, but will tend to increase the blood pressure by keeping more blood in the arteries. And it makes your hair stand on end, which is kind of a funny story. If you've ever looked at a cat or a dog, when they get scared, their hair stands on end, probably as a way of kind of making themselves look bigger and more frightening. Humans have the same muscles, and these muscles stand on end when we get an sympathetic activity. In humans, though, since we have so little body hair for a mammal, it just kind of makes us look bumpy. It's much less intimidating. Anyway. So, next receptor is the alpha-2. These also respond better to norepinephrine than epinephrine. These are mostly found in the digestive system. They're also found in the pancreas. Now, to say they increase or decrease activity is a little harder to say, because it really depends on what they're in. So we can't easily say, do they increase it or decrease it? They generally decrease digestive activity, but they increase glucagon secretion from the pancreas and decrease insulin secretion. So they're a little more subtle in terms of do they activate or deactivate. It kind of goes both ways. All right, third one, beta-1 receptors. These respond equally to norepinephrine and epinephrine. They're found on the heart, and they increase heart rate and strength. And then finally, beta-2 receptors. These respond better to epinephrine than norepinephrine. They are found in a few very distinctive places. They're found in the bronchi and bronchioles. They're found in the bladder. And they're found in blood vessels, specifically in the heart, liver, and skeletal muscle. And beta 2s generally decrease activity. So think about what that means in this case. When adrenaline or epinephrine is released from your adrenal medulla, it's going to go to the bronchi and decrease the activity of the smooth muscle, which is going to let them dilate, giving you more airflow. It tends to go to the bladder, suppressing that smooth muscle so you don't pee. And it tends to go to specific blood vessels and dilate them, which means that while you're constricting a lot of blood vessels from your alpha-1 receptors, you are at that moment also dilating the vessels that go to your heart, liver, and skeletal muscle, which increases blood flow to those areas in particular. Which makes sense if you think that the sympathetic nervous system is active when your body perceives a threat. So when you're ready to fight or flee, you're going to need muscle, you're going to need heart, and you're going to need liver because the liver is what's going to release extra blood glucose for you. So, if you think about what all of these sympathetic receptors do, all together, that kind of produces the fight or flight response, which makes some sense. Now, worth noting, all of these receptors, the muscarinic and adrenergic receptors, are all G protein coupled, which means their responses are a little slower and longer lasting than some other receptors. Also remember, we call those metabotropic receptors. So we'll talk a little bit about how those work when we get to those target organs as we go through the rest of the body. Alrighty. I believe that covers everything I wanted to cover on the peripheral nervous system, which means we are actually done with the whole nervous system. So good job. Congratulations. And next thing we're going to do is move on to the muscular system. So I will see you when we get to that.